Yes.
And okay, why don't we start in prayer? Gracious God, we give you thanks for this time together. Lord, we pray that you're with us as we wrestle with a difficult passage, and pray that you'll open our ears and our minds and our hearts to the good news that's within it. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we do have a challenging passage today. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 21, verses 33 through 46.
Let Owen read it.
Joe said we should let Owen read it. Nobody's going to hear it. What I'll do is actually this time, why don't I read it so that both Owen and everybody else can listen along, okay?
Sounds good.
All right, I'll share my screen with you. Okay. This is the parable of the wicked tenants. Jesus said, "Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance.' So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants?" And they said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him produce at harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. Okay. So this is the third parable in Matthew in chapters 20 and 21, where Jesus uses the imagery of the vineyard. Now, this parable, it closely parallels the song of the vineyard, which is found in Isaiah 5. We're actually going to read that passage in worship on Sunday. It's helpful to read the Old Testament song to note the similarities. The religious leaders to whom Jesus tells the parable, well, they're no doubt, they're going to be familiar with the passage from Isaiah. Would you guys like to read that one? Just for comparison's sake, I can pull it up for us.
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, just give me a second. All right, so All right, so the song of the unfruitful vineyard. Let me sing for my beloved, my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. He expected it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I've not done in it? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste. Shall not be pruned or hoed. Shall be overgrown with briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds, that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry. Okay.
Just as confusing as the first one.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm lost.
I'm lost too, Rick.
So basically, in the Song of the Vineyard, what happens is the farmer, the landowner, plants this beautiful garden, this beautiful vineyard, spares no expense and puts all the top ingredients into this, gets the best vines that plants, puts a fence around it, puts a watchtower, a wine vat, all expecting to produce wonderful grapes that he can make into fine wine. But what happens is they get bad grapes, they get wild grapes. And he's so frustrated with this that he decides, that's it, I'm taking out all the stuff that I invested into this vineyard, and I'm just going to let it get trampled and overgrown and leave it for loss. Now, in the Isaiah passage, the prophet is comparing that to the Jewish people. That God did all these things for you, God set all this up for you, and you still didn't behave well. You still turned away from God and mistreated one another. And Isaiah is warning the people, well, God is going to be done with you. God's going to leave you for dead. God's going to let all your enemies come and get you. And that's what happens to the people. So now comparing it to what Jesus is saying, who is Jesus saying are the bad grapes?
The Pharisees.
Yeah. Yeah, the Pharisees. Yeah, well, yes. Owen said the tenants. And that's who Jesus is not calling them bad grapes. He's saying they're bad tenants of the vineyard. And he's comparing it to the Pharisees. They're not too happy about that.
But wasn't in Matthew, isn't the vineyard great, fantastic grapes for wine? But in the other one, it's he's talking about people. I mean, where's the comparison?
So what the link is, Joe, that Jesus is saying is it's not that all the grapes are bad, so it's not that all the people are bad, right? Isaiah was saying all the people had turned away from God. But what Jesus is saying is the grapes are still good, the people are good, but the ones who are in charge of those grapes, or the Pharisees, they're the ones that are rotten. So rather than wipe out the entire garden, in Jesus' version, he says, I'm going to get rid of the people who are in charge.
Right.
And ultimately the Son.
Yeah, and the son, I mean, the son gets sacrificed there, right?
That's easy
Son
to
is
see who
sent by
that
the
is.
Father. Yeah. So the characters in Isaiah's story, they're clearly identified. God is the owner of the vineyard, who lovingly and carefully digs up the soil, clears it of stones, and plants the best vines. A watchtower is made to protect the vineyard, and a wine vat is constructed for the harvest. Again, as I was saying, the vineyard is Israel, Judah is the planting, but despite the owner's loving care, only wild grapes are found. So let's put ourselves in God's shoes for the Old Testament passage here. Have you ever worked on a project and didn't get the results that you had hoped for?
Sure.
Many times.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Lots of times. Lots of us have, we've put our full effort into something and it just didn't turn out the way that we wanted. So how does it feel when that happens?
disappointing.
Frustrating.
Yeah.
Frustrating, yeah.
Yeah, it's frustrating, it's disappointing,
Disheartening.
disheartening. Yeah. You may even start to lose faith in yourself and second guess yourself if you really did everything that you needed to do. Or sometimes even more frustrating is if you know you did everything that you could do and it still didn't turn out the way that you wanted it to. So likewise, in the parable of the wicked tenants, the same kind of loving care is depicted in the landowner's actions. But in this case, the vineyard is entrusted to tenants who refuse the owner the harvest. They abuse the owner's servants and they kill the owner's son. So what are some possibilities why the tenants didn't treat the heir better?
Jealous, maybe?
Okay.
Greedy. Greedy, maybe?
Jealous, they
exactly.
were greedy.
Greed.
They wanted all the grapes for themselves.
Yep, they
Mhm.
wanted it all for themselves.
If
Oh,
these
that's
are the
good.
Pharisees, they don't want to relinquish their power.
Yep. Yeah, Rick said the Pharisees, they don't want to relinquish their power. And that's the connection that Jesus is making between these tenants and the Pharisees. So this leads to the pronouncement of judgment and rejection. The original tenants who confuse ownership with stewardship are replaced by other people. And again, we'll say that, I'm going to say that again. The original tenants, they confuse ownership with stewardship. So what's the difference between ownership and stewardship?
You're going to check it? Who's this?
Ownership is the owner and stewardship is taking care of it.
Right, right. Ownership means you own it. It's yours. Stewardship means it belongs to someone else, but you've been entrusted to care for it. So what's Jesus saying then about the Pharisees and the priests?
But they're not taking care of God's creation.
Yeah,
Right.
they're not taking care of God's
They're- those
creation.
people.
Good. What else?
They think they know better.
They think they know better? Good. They're afraid of losing their power, Owen said. Because what Jesus is saying is, who do they think is at the top of the pecking order?
They are.
Themselves.
They think they're at the top of the pecking order. They think they're in charge. They think it's their church.
Yeah.
But who's really in charge?
God.
Oh, God.
God is really in charge. They've forgotten that
ultimate
God is the head of the church. Then God is the one in charge. They put themselves at the top of the mountain. They think it's all about them, which really is the root of all sin. So how did the chief priests and the Pharisees respond to this parable?
They wanted to arrest Jesus.
Yeah, they wanted to arrest Jesus. They've had enough at this point. Again, remember, this is after Jesus came into Jerusalem. So Palm Sunday just happened. And he comes in, and what major event happens after that?
He overturns the money changers and throws them out of the temple.
Yeah, he drives the money changers out of the temple angrily. I mean, it's probably the angriest you see Jesus in all the Gospels. It's the closest he gets to violence. You know, he's whipping them with cords, and he's kicking them out and telling them that they've made a mockery of God's temple. And right after that, he starts telling these parables about vineyards and inciting parables. I mean, saying how, you know, God is going to kick these people out and God is going to punish them. And next week says how God is going to throw them into the abyss where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. So, you know, not that Jesus had a good relationship with the Pharisees up until now. They always were contentious, but he really crosses the line in this section here. And that's when the Pharisees have had enough. They're like, that's it. We got to get rid of this guy.
Away from him, please.
All right, so there's several points to note here. Both the heir and Jesus, so the heir in the parable and Jesus, they're killed outside the walls of the vineyard or outside the walls of Jerusalem. Also, note that the Greek word for time isn't chronos. Now that's what, you know, English is a young language, so we have like one word for concepts that cover a variety of meanings. But Greek would have multiple words for what we would call time that would have different nuances to it. So in Greek, the word chronos is like, what time is it? But the word that's used in this parable is kairos, which means more the fullness of time, like an expecting mother saying to her spouse, it's time, it's time to give birth, or the time has come. You know, so there's a difference there. So this parable, it's been interpreted to give the early church its legitimacy as the new tenants of the vineyard. But its message and its challenge, it speaks to the church of every age. God lovingly, graciously calls us into the vineyard. God plants and equips the vineyard, the church, and then entrusts it to our stewardship. Now, God's intention is a full, rich harvest of the fruits. And we hear over and over again, the harvest time will come. But the question and the challenge for us is, will we have the courage to be faithful stewards, bearing fruit? So what role does courage have when it comes to bearing fruit? What kind of courage does it take to be a good steward?
Yeah.
I think it takes a lot of courage, because really what you're doing to be a good steward is you really have to go against what the rest of the world is doing. You know,
Yeah, it does.
you know, somebody who followed Jesus, you know,
Okay.
it was risky business because they were really going against what the rest of the whole
told you to
Jewish
get a new
community
meter.
believed. And so, I mean, I think it takes a lot of courage to, to really be a good steward.
Yeah. Yeah, because again, being a good steward means who's first, who's on top.
God.
God.
God,
God,
right? And the world doesn't want that. The rest of the world wants to put themselves on top. And people don't like it when you push them down from power. So Vicky's right. You're going to get pushback. You're going to get lots of bad tenants that are going to come against you.
Bread doesn't go stale, of course.
So what are the fruits that we're talking about here? Obviously, it's a parable. It's an allegory. So what are the fruits that God is looking for?
Of the fruits of the Spirit that Paul talked about: kindness, gentleness, generosity.
the other people, yeah.
Yep, exactly.
And to give your first fruits to God.
Vicky had said the fruits of the Spirit that Paul talked about. It's kindness, gentleness, caring. Jeff, I didn't hear what you were saying.
I said, and to realize that we have to give our first fruits to God before anything else, before anyone else.
Yeah, and giving those first fruits to God instead of holding on for ourselves.
Could have a collapsed trachea. Could have.
Basically giving the harvest back to God.
Hang on one second, guys. Sorry. All right. Owen, do I have you there? I lost you for a second. Okay. Yeah, I know. I'll try and repeat back when people say stuff so you can hear. But so, what do you find challenging in this modern day parable? This goes off of the courage question.
Well, sometimes you want to just take the first fruits yourself,
Sometimes
Yeah.
you want to take the first fruits for yourself.
right? That's part of what's wrong with the world. Not give back.
Yeah, we have a lot of that sentiment of, take what's yours.
Right.
Well, we also have to realize that everything that we have comes from God. We don't, even if we think we're producing something, it's still out of the gifts that God has given us. So, I mean, that's hard to remember, because we all think that, we're producing, we're responsible for ourselves, but really everything does come from God.
Yeah, recognizing that we're stewards and not owners of everything that we have. And again, that goes totally against what the world teaches us, right?
Yeah.
I have mine. I have to hold on to mine.
Isn't the devil out there making deals with people?
Is the devil out there making deals with people? Possibly. And I think, I don't know that it's as overt as, a guy with horns and a tail saying, if you sign your soul, I'll make you rich and famous. But I do think he whispers in the back of our minds and says, you deserve this. You should hold on to this. You earned this.
You earned it, yeah.
They didn't.
Well, I mean, to that matter, our egos could really be viewed as the devil, because it's our ego that tells us, you got this, you built this, you big, but really, I love the acronym, our egos leave God out. And so when we don't listen to our egos, that's when we're putting God first.
Yep.
You know, we put God above everything else.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when we do the baptismal service and we do the renunciation of evil, we ask people to renounce the sin in our own heart, in our own minds. It's that voice in the back of us. And, it, you know, we could say that it's our ego, it's our subconscious. We could see it as the evil one whispering in our ears. And it's probably an amalgamation of all those things there.
What do you think of that truck, Joseph?
So is there anything comforting about this to you?
I like it.
Well, that's on the side of you, so he can have to listen.
Well, there is, because God isn't giving up like in the Isaiah passage. He's not just saying the vineyard is going to go to hell in a handbasket and there's going to be chaos and there's, you know, in this passage, God says, I'm going to bring in new tenants. You know, there's going to be an opportunity for new people to follow my ways and to, you know.
Oh, the screen keys in there.
So that's, you know, I mean, he's not giving up because the Pharisees have screwed up.
Yeah.
He's going to give a whole new generation of people a chance to now follow his son.
Right.
And that's
Right.
us.
Yeah. Yeah. And that really is the long view good news in the passage, right? And actually, even in Isaiah, if you keep going, there's good news there also. The section that we read was all about God, you know, washing his hands and saying, you know, that's it, I'm done. Sorry, hold on. But we know that even after Israel gets defeated, even, you know, after everything falls apart for Israel, Isaiah then comes back and says, but God isn't going to give up on you. God is going to restore you and bring you back. So the vineyard may get overgrown for now, but God is still going to come back and rebuild it. And Vicki, what you were saying in the gospel was that God's not giving up on the vineyard. God's replacing the tenants, the ones that are in charge. But God doesn't give up on God's people. Now, this might be a little easier one to find, but what's disturbing about the passage?
That you'll be crushed by the stone.
Yeah, right? So it's easy for us, Rick, to say, well, yeah, he's talking about those Pharisees because they screwed up mightily. You know, they didn't do God's will, so God's going to kick them out and get somebody new. Well, it's easy for us to say it about that group of people 2,000 years ago. But again, as we were talking about this, we said that now we're the stewards of the vineyard. And that's challenging to hear that, well, if you're not doing it, God's going to get somebody else to do it.
Now, were the tenants doing this on their own accord, or was somebody whispering in their ear?
All right, Owen, hold on one second. I'm going to answer what Joe just said, and then I'll repeat what you were saying, Owen, okay? So Joe is asking, are the tenants doing this bad work on their own accord, or was somebody influencing them? Well, it doesn't say. And again, maybe it's an amalgamation. Maybe it's their own ego. Maybe it's their own greed. Maybe it's the evil one whispering in their ear, or a combination of that. Just like it is for us. Owen, what were you saying? Go ahead and say it again so I can repeat it to the group. Yep. Yeah. So Owen was bringing up the hypocrite example. And Jesus uses hypocrite often to talk about the Pharisees and the religious authorities. And Owen was saying that some people nowadays, they say they don't want to go to church because churches are just full of hypocrites. People who say one thing and act one way in front of everybody, but then they do other stuff when they don't think anybody's looking. Or, Monday through Saturday, they act differently. And if that's the case, then they're right. Because Jesus calls us not to be hypocrites. But the mistake that I think we make often is that we think that the opposite of being a hypocrite is being a perfect person. And that's what leads us to being hypocrites, because we feel like we have to put on an air of perfection, thinking that that's what God is requiring of us. But obviously, Owen listened to my sermon last week, so thank you, because I had said there that one thing God never calls us is to be perfect. Not in this world. There's a point where God says be perfect, but he means something different. But God isn't expecting us to be these perfect people. God's expecting us to be honest and authentic. And we're closest to God when we're at our weakest moments. Because it's when we're at our weakest moments that we recognize that we're not in charge, that we're not the owners, that we don't have control. And it's then that we're most open to give up our control to God. And that's the root of everything. Everything about faithful living starts with giving it up to God. After you do that, everything falls in place naturally. But the problem is, that's the hardest thing to do.
Oh, yeah.
It is, yeah.
Mhm.
It's a lot easier to say, I'm not going to curse today, or I'm not going to kill somebody today, or, I'm not going to blaspheme today. But those are all just ancillary things, because it's all at the root. Remember, Jesus says the most important commandment is love God with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Once you start with that, everything else falls in place. The problem is, and what Jesus is saying, why he's saying they're hypocrites, is because they're following the 260 whatever laws that are listed by the letter. They don't eat their pork. They, plant their crops in the right place. They do this or they do that, but they're really not in their heart living a life of faith as it's intended. All right.
Very interesting. Patty, I have one question for you. When you asked Owen to dial in, how did you know his cell phone had a dial on it? That's how old it is.
Calling on his rotary phone.
Right.
Joe's making fun of you, Owen.
Of course.
He's got Mr. Marconi with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened with your audio today, Owen, but hopefully next time we'll be able to get you in fully.
Get an Android, Owen.
Yeah.
Get a kid to help.
Yeah.
He might not have put his attendee ID in. So when you dial in, you have to dial the number, put in the access code, and then there's a little pop-up on Zoom that has an attendee ID on it. And you put that in, and then you get connected with it links together your audio with the Zoom piece. So.
Oh, okay.
Patty, you lost Owen at number 2. You can't tell him 3 things. You can't do 3 things.
Well, all right, everybody. Thank you for good
No, thank you,
discussion today.
Pastor.
This is a tough passage. This is a
Yeah, it
hard
was
one
good today.
to wrestle with.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we close with the Lord's Prayer, okay?
Okay.
Our Father,
Our Father,
who art in heaven,
Right in heaven.
hallowed be thy
hallowed be
name.
thy name. Thy kingdom come,
Thy will
thy
be done
will be done,
on earth as it
on
is in
earth
heaven.
as it is in heaven.
Give
Give
us
Give
this
us this
day
day
our
our
daily bread,
daily bread,
and forgive us our
And forgive us our
trespasses,
trespasses,
as we forgive
even
those who
those who
trespass against
trespass
us.
Against us.
And lead us
and lead us
not
not
into
into
temptation,
temptation,
but
but
deliver us from
deliver us
evil.
from evil.
For thine is
With
the
Thine is the
kingdom,
kingdom,
and the
power,
power, and the
and the
glory,
glory,
forever
forever
and
and
ever.
ever.
Amen.
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 Go in
All
peace
right,
and serve
everyone.
the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you,
Amen.
everyone.
Thank you,
Have a
God.
great day.
See you
We're going to meet
tomorrow.
again on, I have a couple meetings on Saturdays, so we're not going to get together again until the 24th. October 24th, 9 a.m., we're going to be in person for that one. If the weather is conducive to it, we'll be outside. If it's not, if it's either too cold or if it's raining, we'll be in the social hall, okay?
Okay.
All right, everybody, have a great day.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
too, Pastor.
Bye.